Hello and welcome to the ICC Academy Livecast, a new podcast series where we take a deeper dive into global business trends and ideas. I'm your host, Thomas Paris, and today I'm joined by Alex Capri, Senior Fellow and Lecturer at the National University of Singapore. In this episode, we will discuss how artificial intelligence and mobile devices have and will revolutionize the way businesses function, and how various industries are transforming their business activities to create room for the future. Our discussion today is being live streamed to YouTube, so for everyone listening now, remember to participate in the conversation by leaving your questions in the chat. So, Alexanders, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Maybe we can start by sort of a macro overview and clearing up some common misconceptions that we have about artificial intelligence, and maybe what the differences are between artificial intelligence and what most people think about with AI, which is sentience.
Okay, I think that's a great place to start because I think there is a lot of misunderstanding and frankly there's a lot of hype about AI, what it is and what it can and what it can't do. When you hear the term artificial intelligence, that really just means any technique that enables computers to mimic human behavior, right? So that's, it could be cognitive. It could, of course, be, programming a computer to behave physically in a certain way, a robot. So AI is essentially buried in almost everything. It's ubiquitous, right? When we think about the common things that we have today, the phone in our pockets, and then we can come back to that. Mm-hmm. Machine learning is basically a subset of different AI techniques, and they use statistical methods basically to enable machines to improve, to do things faster, more intelligently. And when you think about machine learning, what comes to mind to me is AlphaGo, for example, which is the machine learning algorithm essentially that defeated Lee Sedol, the then world champion of Go, of the ancient the ancient Chinese board game of Go, which is highly complex. If you think of chess and you think of chess, exponentially more complex in terms of thinking ahead with the next moves, the next 10, 20, 30 moves. So AlphaGo defeated Lee Sedol. And then the next generation of machine learning along the same board game was AlphaGo Zero, which essentially, in 40 days, self-taught, every single potential move, taught itself how to essentially become the grand master of Go. Wow. Having no experience, no human supervision. How did this happen? Well, it was essentially, a whole network of algorithms sort of laid on top of one another, connecting, every which way, predicting different outcomes, et cetera, and then actually leading to these different outcomes that would allow the game to become what it became. Now, Sentient AI is the one that makes its way into the science fiction films and the one that you hear people talking about, and that is where machines attain self-awareness and they become sentient. Excuse me. So sentience in an AI framework would meet the Alan Turing test. Now, Alan Turing was, of course, the brilliant mathematician, computer scientist that cracked the Enigma code during the Second World War. The British cracked the code of the Nazis, and he developed really the first computer. And the Turing test basically says that if a machine can essentially exhibit intelligent behavior equivalent to or indistinguishable from a human being, then it's on its way, or it's potentially sentient in that regard. But the science fiction basically takes it a step further and turns it into
more nefarious.
Machines that kill off the human race. Machines that become that exhibit all of the worst human traits and characteristics. Only they're a billion times smarter and faster than humans. So that's what I think what we hear most when we hear the term sentient AI.
That's interesting, and I assume we are several decades away from something like this. I mean, it's difficult to predict, but I mean, if we take a step back, maybe it would be interesting to take a look at. I mean, AI is not something that is in the faraway future. We're already using AI, right? We can take a look at the science fiction movies and say, okay, well, this would be either a best or worst case scenario, depending on which one you're watching. But AI is something that we've been working on for, I would say, the last 30 years when it comes to anything that has to do with machines. And just, maybe you could give us some examples of ways that we're already using AI.
Well, AI is ubiquitous, right? It's in everything that we have now, and in the future, when we start talking about the Internet of Things and 5G networks connecting, so-called sentient devices that are not only producing data but are basically have the ability to sense, whether it's visually or otherwise, and then turn those sensory perceptions into data. So it's everywhere, but. I think there are certain requirements that AI has to take it to the next level. In other words, what are the core elements that determine how sophisticated and how ubiquitous AI is? And the first, of course, is computing power.
Right.
So to what extent can we continue to increase computing power to deal with the second really important element, and that is data. So as more people, more devices, more platforms, more digital activity produces more and more data, we need the computing power to be able to deal with that data. And the algorithms and the AI that are being created around that data, whether they be for real-time feedback loops to produce predictive analysis or any kind of cognitive analysis that's going to basically intuit what to do next, or why this is better than that, and why this outcome should be pursued rather than that outcome, etc. All of that is dependent upon computing power, data. And in this age, where you have the global commons, where you have this phenomenon of instant information available everywhere, and it's almost infinite, that all comes down to and I think the development of AI comes down to collaborative networks, networks of people working on open source platforms. So all of that, I think, is what drives the development of AI, and then eventually that finds its way into our everyday devices.
Right.
So if you think of the smartphone, and you look at how humans, of course, we evolve biologically. It takes us many thousands of years to evolve to take on new characteristics, whereas technology evolves and has been evolving exponentially. So, you may have heard many times, I'm sure your listeners have heard this many times, but if you look at the amount of computing power that put the first astronauts on the moon, and even that whole Apollo series, I mean, our pocket phones are way more powerful than that. And, if the capacity, if the AI capacity of our pocket devices continue to expand exponentially, within 30 years, our phones will be a billion times more powerful than they are now, which is it's a very promising thought, but at the same time, it's a terrifying thought, and you can see why the group of people that think that AI is going to basically wipe out the human race, they look at this type of thing and they say, well, human biological evolution versus technological evolution, and we don't have a chance.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I think that's an interesting point. I think there's a lot of scholars now who are taking a look at, you mentioned the Turing test, where it's not so much now that the fear is that they pass it, it's that they choose to fail it.
Yes.
And I think that's an interesting way to look at it as well. Like, well, once it gets smart enough to know why it is that we're testing them.
Yes, and that, of course, assumes that artificial intelligence will have all of the same qualities that we have as humans, which, if you go back to our evolution, we've developed some pretty nasty characteristics. Certainly, when it comes to survival and defeating our opponents, destroying our opponents, etc., outsmarting them, outwitting them, tricking them, whatever it happens to be. I'm not so sure that that's necessarily how computers have to be. Will be programmed or will behave. And I think Stuart Russell, who's a computer scientist at UC Berkeley, he's one of the very vocal critics of AI in terms of developing in such a way that it will become harmful or even destructive.
Right.
He's come up with some interesting ideas about programming computers to have uncertainty. So if you can program artificial intelligence to get to that point where the programmers intentionally put uncertainty or put the function of uncertainty into their modus operandi, and possibly even humility and possibly even compassion, if that can be done, then that means that they won't necessarily behave and take on the worst characteristics of human beings. But again, I think we're quite a ways away from that.
Right, and I think we're going to get into the inherent biases that could make them their way into the algorithms that we are programming, at least in the first generation. But I think maybe before we get into that, you mentioned the data sets themselves. It would be worthwhile to take a look at the different industries and with the types of data that would be feeding into these first generation algorithms, these AI systems. We can take a look at healthcare, we can take a look at transportation, manufacturing. Which ones do you think are going to be the ones to adopt AI in a way that maybe we're not even imagining yet? Or the ones that are at the forefront?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I would put the question, which industries will not be impacted by or cannot be impacted by AI? And I think I struggle to come up with any, because in any sector, in any industry where we have data, which is everything, everywhere, that data is part and parcel to decision making. It's part and parcel to actionable, decisions that are made. So I think you mentioned healthcare. Certainly, if you look at what is happening in healthcare today, and you look at, for example, applications with IBM's Watson, that is classifying imagery. And being able to take the images from the diagnoses of hundreds of thousands of different doctors from around the world and use AI to look for emergent patterns that would indicate, for example, that you have a retinal dysfunction or you have some kind of red flag for a health issue. That is a really, really powerful thing. So to be able to use AI, things like speech recognition, to be able to use AI for any cognitive predictive behavior, of course. So whether that happens to be, for health and safety in the logistics industry, whether it's, it could be virtually anything, right, Thomas? I think...
And social media is already using those algorithms.
And social media is using it, and of course social media, many of those algorithms are imperfect, to say the least, right. Or perhaps you could say that the business model around the social media platform is flawed. I would say I think it's a little bit of both, in terms of this, this click-through advertising model, which I think leads to a kind of data bias, with that, where the machine is trying to funnel people to the most extreme positions because those are the most predictable. Right. Positions, and if you can predict behavior, then you can feed targeted advertising more effectively to people, and so it becomes this sort of self-perpetuating cycle, this negative cycle. But back to the original premise of the question, which is which industries. I think look at banking and finance.
I was going to go to that because I think that's one that has the most potential to cause problems, at least in the short term.
Well, first of all, markets are still so complex that I think claiming to have any kind of an AI function that can predict, that can accurately predict market behavior and market outcomes, I think we're a long, long way from that. And I think the reason for that is, and I don't know if we'll ever get there, is because of the total random nature of life, where something completely unpredictable can affect markets and people behave. And of course, the other is the irrational nature of markets. So can a computer algorithm ever factor in all of the irrational and emotional behavior of people? Hard to say, but at this point in time, I think we're a long way away from that. But having said that, if you look at what AI has already done and is doing in the banking sector, we're now in this environment where we're talking about open banking, where the European Union is passing legislation that is requiring banks to essentially use APIs to connect their customer data to fintech companies, to other banks, to other institutions, to try and take that data and create more value, right? And more competition, actually. It also levels the playing field. So if you look at the amount of AI that is behind all of that, where, I take your banking data and through, different interfaces, I bounce back all kinds of information about what kind of insurance you should have, what kind of investments we would recommend that you have, what kind of travel discounts are out there for you. I mean, all of that, based on data, based on your bank data, which, can then, again, with AI, can be used to make predictions and to enhance value and increase customer satisfaction. So in the banking industry, so healthcare, banking, obviously transportation, and many other areas.
Right. And there is a wide spectrum of ways to qualify and categorize AI. I guess on both sides of that, one way to categorize these would be on opaque versus transparent algorithms. And one of my questions was, why would a company, and maybe going back to the finance sector would be an interesting example, why would a company choose to opt in for an opaque AI? And by opaque, we essentially mean that it would be difficult for the algorithm to explain why it came to specific kinds of results, versus a transparent AI, which could, in human language, and so to speak, would be able to explain how it got to a certain result.
Well, one explanation might be that they're operating inside of a so-called black box, and that black box is very profitable to them because no one else has figured out their formula or has their secret sauce, right? So they have something of value that they want to monopolize, basically. But those days are increasingly more and more difficult, to continue operating like that. Those days are increasingly more and more difficult for, if you take, for example, professional services firms. I spent many years working in the consulting industry with, global consulting firms. And when I first started, the black box was that was our secret sauce, right? I mean, there were people within the company that knew these regulations and they knew this process and they knew that, and companies would come and say, draft us a strategy or an optimization plan, to extract the most value out of this course of action. And so we would go into the black box, and we would develop it and then send them a nice hefty invoice for that. Right. But that's becoming much more difficult today, because as more and more information is online, as more and more resources are online, and that's all transparent, because of open networks and because of access to human capital, access to websites and all kinds. I mean, think about it. Think about Google Analytics, for example, or just all of the different platforms that are out there, that if you don't know how to do something, they know how to do it, or they can help you figure out how to do it, or they can put you, they can connect you with somebody who can make you do it. Suddenly now the black boxes everywhere are turning into glass boxes, where they become very, very transparent. And that means that you have disintermediation. So going back to your question, to avoid being disintermediated, right, for, to hang on to a niche that, whose days are numbered. The other is, intentional opaqueness would would be required in some cases, to create data security, for example. Where there are certain things that have to be opaque, because if not, it constitutes either a privacy risk, which is, I think, an increasing element now in any kind of data value chain. Is, yes, you want transparency, but how do you protect it from either being ripped off, attacked, or how do you just protect people's private data? Which I think is this is the issue of this decade. I think we're going to see dramatic changes coming to the business models of social media in particular, but even companies like Google around data, and how data is bought and sold, who gets the proceeds, what absolutely has to remain private. And what doesn't. And of course, again, I think the Europeans are leading the way on this here with GDPR, right? The General Data Protection Regulations. And if you look at what GDPR has done to business models of the big platform companies around the world, it's really imposing some challenges. So opaqueness in that regard to protect, I can understand.
Right. And it doesn't necessarily have to be intentional. I mean, I threw that in there just to get your perspective on this, but it could also be unintentional. Just you mentioned it at the top, where if we introduce a certain number of randomized events into a sort of different catalyst into a simulation, it would be almost impossible to explain why you got to that conclusion. If you add enough nodes that are programmed to be random, then it would be the conclusion, the summary from the AI to the human analysis behind it would be almost incomprehensible, because you'd be running endless simulations, and there would be no logic.
That's right. Which is why human intelligence is still so important and is going to remain so important well into the future. Right. And so even as AI becomes more advanced and does more things for us, the need to have human intervention and human intelligence involved in that process is going to remain for a long time to come.
At what point is this human intervention going to slow the progression and evolution of the AI itself? And maybe also from a different angle is there inherent bias from us that will feed into the AI itself, which we end up sort of subconsciously or consciously trying to program an algorithm to get the results we are looking for or expect?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's increasing talk now about what people are referring to as a so-called AI winter. And the AI winter is a phenomenon that basically means that we reach a point in AI where there isn't a lot of advancement with a net positive effect. And one of the reasons why this could happen is because of this techlash that we're experiencing now, and I think for good reason. Just look at what has been happening with Facebook, right? And social media platforms in general. Frankly, the corrosive effect that they're having on democracies, this whole phenomenon of fake news, and so on. Faulty algorithms, data bias, all of these things having real social consequences. Right. You think about, for example, misinformation and fake news in India recently that led to mob lynchings, for example, people actually dying because of this, right? And so this AI winter could be brought about by a really, really strong dose of regulation, for example, where governments and societies basically say, hey, look, all of this stuff is great, but if it is wreaking havoc on society, then we have to step back, basically, and we have to rethink this whole thing. That's absolutely possible. Now, will that stop innovation? Will that stop people from experimenting? No, of course not. Right. That will continue. Will that stop the advancement of AI and everything from genetics to gene splicing to military applications of AI. No, it won't. But for more broader applications, and another area I think of is 5G. So everybody's talking about 5G, and internationally we have this news story about Huawei, the Chinese company that is one of the leading companies building 5G networks, and whether or not they should be involved in building networks because of espionage and this type of thing. The broader issue is that the internet as we see it today is broken. It's broken in that it is absolutely riddled with backdoors and security traps, and it's highly susceptible to malware of every kind and cyber intrusions. And to think that to fundamentally build 5G networks on top of a infrastructure that really needs to be overhauled and rethought, and there are people looking at how to fundamentally rebuild the internet. That's another potential sort of AI winter event whereby people say, well, hang on a minute, let's back up. So again, I think there will be, because of all of these things that we're talking about, I think we will see the increase of the so-called splinter net, where essentially you have this fragmentation, this balkanization of the World Wide Web, essentially, as different influences, ring fence off parts of their, whether it's a nationalist boundary, so it could be the Chinese, for example, with the Great Firewall of China, and so all of these things, I think, will put speed bumps. Certainly, will become obstacles to the development of AI. But ultimately, AI will continue. Innovation will continue.
Yeah, I can't help but think that the notion of an AI winter, as you mentioned, is a little optimistic. The reason I say that is because it seems as though we are hurtling towards building AI at whatever the cost. And I'm trying to wrap my head around why that could be the case. And the only conclusion I was able to get is that the only way to really understand something is to make it. And I think that one of the things that we don't fully understand is our own brain.
Absolutely.
So I think that this drive would almost give us a sense of understanding and purpose of now we understand what it means to be conscious. Right. Now we understand all the intricacies that go into being a person, right? Yes. And I think that might be something, an undercurrent of what's driving this passion, whether it's on, through movies or even just on academia and scientific front. But I don't think that there would be almost anything that could be done that would be able to stop the progress of AI, because it impassions people to such a level that it really is crazy. And we're getting to a point now where we're getting to the event horizon where we're going to be having cases of AI being so useful that we can never go back.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, I think the humans, of course, are inherently curious, and we're inherently competitive. So those are two forces that pretty much are going to drive, continual development of AI. The fact is that, every great technology that we've ever had, that we've come up with, have had an upside and a downside. There have been comparisons. I'm not so sure this is totally the right comparison, but there have been many comparisons, particularly when looking at the negative impact of AI to the splitting of the atom, basically, to nuclear weapons, etc. And actually, there are those, including Elon Musk, of Tesla, and the late great Professor Stephen Hawking, who've basically said, "Look, AI is going to be far more terrible than nuclear weapons at some point if we don't figure out how to control it." But there's no way to stop it. There is absolutely no way to stop progress. And this is the dilemma. This is the ethical dilemma that we're in. Is that even where we have societies and we have nation states that will promote frameworks of rules, very necessary frameworks of rules around the development and the application of AI, there will be both non-state actors and state actors that will be pursuing the development of AI in all different kinds of capacities. And so that's just, that's Pandora's box, right? It's open, and you can't put that back in. So that train has left the station. I just hope that between a combination of good leadership and civil society and the right kind of engagement, that we can manage to continue to reap the benefits of AI, which I think there are so many, and try to keep the downside in check.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there are so many similarities. Like you mentioned that. Another one that comes to mind is genetic reprogramming, where there are so many benefits that you can use to justify why we should, right? When it comes to, neutering diseases of any kind. Let's take a look at this. But against all our better judgment, against all the worst case scenarios we were, facing, we're still going to plow ahead no matter what. There are some parts of the world that are going faster than others, but I think that's an inevitability, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and then of course you have the issue that a lot of people are worried about, and that is, will robots take our jobs?
Yes.
Which we could spend all night talking about, right?
Right.
And the answer is yes and no. Yes, if someone is performing a very repetitive cognitive task and getting paid for that a machine could do, then yes, those jobs eventually will be phased out. And I think what's interesting is most people, when they think about robots replacing humans, they tend to think about robots replacing physical activity. So robots in warehouses,
tangible robots.
So actual tangible robots. Right. There's a company called Boston Dynamics. You've probably seen some of the videos. I would suggest to your listeners to go check out the website. I mean, that is, these are physical robots, mobile robots that are remarkable and a bit creepy, I must say.
Yes.
To look at.
Inspired some fun Black Mirror episodes.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. The one of the dog, right?
Yes.
That dog-like.
Heavy metal.
That dog, heavy metal, yes, absolutely. But actually, robotics is every bit as much about replacing cognitive activity. So any kind of cognitive repetitive activity that can be replaced, those jobs are gone.
Right.
Those jobs are disappearing fast. So, and that's pretty broad. I mean, depending on which studies you read and you look at, as many as 30% or 40% of all the jobs as we know them today, in the next 25, 30 years could be replaced. Now that creates other dilemmas, right? That creates social dilemmas. And actually that's why institutions like the ICC are around, right? Because one of the big challenges is, how do people's work lives remain meaningful? In other words, how can they remain gainfully employed, and hopefully, how can they do something that actually is, something that gives them self-worth and self-respect? These are important things. So the interesting thing is with all this disruption, yes, you have companies and businesses that will be replaced and disintermediated, and you have human jobs that will be replaced. But then you have a whole new wave of new demands that will require new skill sets and new jobs. And that's really, we're sitting here in Singapore. If you look at the emphasis that the Singaporean government is placing on retraining and upskilling everyone, basically, to be able to future-proof. Right. This is actually, the Singapore model is actually a really good blueprint for what I would say should be an urban sort of city development, city model, where you go city by city and you figure out how to retrain, upskill, you bring together the right parties, you bring, public-private partnerships. Around a lot of these new skills, that are going to be part and parcel of this digital economy. And as we said earlier, the need for human intervention will remain for many, many years to come, for all kinds of new types of supervision, creativity, etc.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you touch on education. I'm a little biased about why I want to highlight this one, but even on a personal level, you're right, there is going to be a transition period, right, from the earned industries that exist today versus the industries that we're going to need after, the ubiquity of AI and robotics. I think that fits in the same category when we talk about jobs. But I'm still relatively young, but I remember when we were still, middle school, high school, where the teachers would come to us and say, you'll never have a calculator always on you. Right? And now I reach in my pocket and I have the phone, which can answer any question that any teacher asks me, and any math problem that's put in front of me. And it's going to be an interesting way of how, and you're 100% right, is how education is going to cope with this. Because if we have new industries, the logical thing that would follow is that we're going to have to change the way, not just the subjects that we teach, but the way that we learn them. And I'm not talking about online learning, but let's take mathematics as an example, right? Going back to the calculator example, how useful is it going to be to learn the specifics of long division? Maybe not as much, but there is an immediate, or I would say an important component of understanding the logic of mathematics. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't necessarily have to be through long division. It could be through coding, right? Which would adapt to the industries of later on. So there is going to be that shift for the young, at least the very young generations now and tomorrow, who are going to be learning different topics with the same end goal, but ones that are a lot more relevant to the industries that are going to be burgeoning.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And you could take that line of logic even further and say, well, why learn a language? Because, with speech recognition and translation AI making progress, eventually you can go anywhere in the world and, you can plop yourself in the middle of any culture that speaks any language and, you pull out your smartphone or whatever it is, and you can communicate or will be able to communicate, which I think leads us back to this dilemma, this AI dilemma, which is, one of the scenarios is, do we become so dependent on AI that we become these, mentally, intellectually, we become these slovenly, beings that do no mental gymnastics whatsoever, or is it just, again, looking at it in terms of augmenting a thought process? That's
interesting. I think it can go one of two ways, right? If you take out, like you mentioned, the repetitive tasks component of a lot of the jobs that are in most industries now, what's left are generally creative studies, and not everybody's built for that, but temporarily, perhaps, that would be the ideal situation, is that we just focus on, art and music and things that, at least for now, AI can't necessarily do. But I think in the long term, it would benefit. This is my opinion, but because going back to the mobile phone, that is essentially already an AI extension of ourselves. Yeah, we've become smarter because of it, right? And it's not that we've become lazier. It depends on who you ask. But I personally believe we've become smarter because instead of using our own brain power on solving tasks that could maybe take 1 hour, we can find a way to do it in 10 minutes. Yeah. Just go on YouTube, Google it, and you have the answer instead of fishing through the library of books. So maybe smart is not the right word, but definitely more efficient.
I would say smart, efficient, and enabled, like never ever before. Think about it. Where the company of the future. When you look at this transition that we're seeing in traditional industry from, what we would call an asset-heavy business model to an asset-light business model. So you can, meaning that you could have a traditional business like a Caterpillar, for example, that makes, earth movers and heavy equipment. Mm-hmm. But now they have a digital shadow of an earth moving, a backhoe, for example, that's producing data, right? And so that is becoming a value creating part of their business because that data is valuable. It can be harvested in different ways, and their customers can use it, for all manner of things. So think about a business of the future where not only traditional businesses are using AI to generate and spin off all kinds of new value from data and information, but think about a business that is nothing more than a brain trust.
Right.
So you and myself and maybe 2 or 3 other people, we decide that we're just going to start a business in some kind of a tech service sector, but we may not necessarily even have the inherent skills or knowledge. We just know what the market demand is, and we just know essentially how to find all of the right resources, patch them together, and essentially bootstrap our way to different solutions and different services. So this is the unbelievable power that ubiquitous AI gives people in the platform economy, for example, where you have the shared economy, the sharing economy, where you have people. When you think of the sharing economy, people think of Airbnb and Grab and Uber. But if you think about it, if you think of all of the potential self-evolving micro markets that just can pop up ad hoc just based on people using an app, where we can decide, hey, look, let's match excess capacity of power tools, of home power tools, with demand. All the people that don't want to go out and buy a power drill, but they need it for a couple hours. How do we match those people up? People who have power drills and people who need them. That can be done on a relatively small scale.
I completely agree, and I think that's a pretty real life example of what I meant by finding creative solutions, right? Because when you take the brick and mortar out of it, then what you're focused on is basically just finding the niches.
Yeah.
Finding new and creative ways of using the infrastructure we have in ways that we're not already using. And we can only do that once we have the technology in our pocket or in the cloud, right? You touch on this also in one of your studies. I'll bring up a little bit later. Is essentially the fact that once you decentralize, and you mentioned you have a small team, all you need is an idea. Right? You don't need to buy all the hardware. You don't need to buy, to bring in all of your team into one location. You can work remotely, right? You can work on, cloud servers that are infinitely more expensive than you could ever buy yourself. And I think that does open up a lot of doors. So as long as you have a good idea, that it can take off. And I think a lot of the startups you mentioned are that.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, absolutely, and I think I think the study you might be referring to is a study that I just did with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, and I looked at micro businesses in Indonesia, and looked at how technology was enabling micro enterprises in an emerging market. I mean, it's Indonesia, but it would apply to any emerging market, and how they are using. For example, what we call social commerce, which is essentially engaging in commerce on social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, et cetera. I mean, it's amazing how much business gets done on these platforms. So the challenge, so the good news is that you have a large sector of humanity represented by micro enterprises, very small businesses in emerging markets that previously have not really participated economically in value chains, in local, regional, and global value chains. Now you have the possibility of a micro enterprise becoming a micronational, right? Being born globally, being born global, as people have said. The question becomes. What kind of opportunities are out there, and what kind of challenges are out there? So all of these micro markets are great, but there still are going to be trust issues, particularly around payment platforms and that type of thing. And then this brings on, and one of the things that I think came out of this study that I did, this brings on an interesting question, which is, if you have many, many small parties all now availing themselves of this new technology and buying and selling and trading, and then you have these trust issues, You have issues around disputes. How do you settle disputes? What kind of digital wallet do you use? Et cetera. Now you have this question that governments are facing, which is, do we let a few really large AI companies dominate everything? Because they can offer that whole ecosystem. They can provide trust. They can connect. They can do all of those things. But in the process, you have the rise of the FANGs, basically, right? Just a handful of massive digital companies that are dominating everybody's data, and you could argue that they are the playing field is not level. Small companies can't compete. They either get squashed, bought up, imitated, etc. So on the one hand, you have this wonderful AI and all these technologies that are empowering small and micro businesses and sole proprietors all over the world, giving them access to all these incredible, wonderful things. But when it comes to a uniform set of rules, a framework of rules, dispute, for cross-border, for example, now we have, of course, for one of the big challenges is that for cross-border data flows, we have data privacy issues, and we have data localization laws, and we have the splinter net that I referred to earlier. So, if you're using a massive platform like Amazon or Alibaba, no problem, right? The trust issues are taken care of. All of that is taken care of. But then you have the downside. Right. So, what's the right balance, right? What do governments have to do? What do policymakers have to do to be able to break the oligopoly, but not squelch, to not crush all these other opportunities, the cross-border opportunities. So it's a real challenge. And I would expect the way we'll see ourselves out of this with the right kind of public-private cooperation. So, with govs, businesses, NGOs, organizations like ICC. I think, that's a big task ahead of us.
Great. Wow. In the interest of time, maybe we'll move into some closing thoughts, because most of the questions we got actually we covered. The one I had actually was, what type of nascent or underestimated technology do you think is going to creep up on us and have the biggest impact over the next 5 years?
Boy, it's
an opinion.
Yes, and the thing, I think the mistake that we all make, whether we're academics or business prognosticators or whatever, is we tend to take the present situation and the present sort of frame of reference that we have and extrapolate, right? And say, okay, well, if we just do a linear extrapolation, this is what the world's going to look like in 10 or 20 years. Right. The fact is that technology is evolving so quickly that we could have a total quantum leap in standards. So we could be talking about nanotechnology and what that's going to be doing to computers and how that will revolutionize and actually potentially solve a lot of the problems that we have with this broken internet that I talked about earlier. So that could absolutely, something completely new and unexpected could come down the road, so to speak. I think the other thing to watch, and I mentioned this earlier, is techlash, and how significantly that is going to change certainly business models and cross-border flows and value chains and that type of thing. Right. I think we're at the beginning of a very significant regulatory era, and that only makes sense because if you look at how fast AI has advanced and how far behind the regulators have been, there's a huge gap to try and make up there.
Right, and it's not necessarily going to be a happy marriage either. I mean, how long did the automotive industry fight seatbelts? Yeah, I mean, you take and this goes way faster than automobile innovation.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think for me as an academic and as a writer and somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about these things, I think it's going to be absolutely essential for in the future that all major AI initiatives, whether they're being researched, whether they're being studied, whether they're being worked on, they have to have an accompanying philosophical component to them. In other words, don't just think about what this technology can do to modify behavior or to dramatically change some kind of cognitive function, or even this if we get to that point to where we really can map the human brain and we can actually build a synthetic human brain that behaves like the human brain. I mean, so I think each and every advancement in AI needs to be paired with the philosophical ramifications and the social impact that that's going to have. And as AI develops, we have to continue to have a mirror regulatory or at least a rules-based, ethical rules-based framework around them. And that's where I think civil society and democracy is very important for that process to work.
No, it's interesting. I mean, it takes us back to the conversation about painting this with our own biases as well, because not everybody has the same value set. It would have to be an international group of people coming together and deciding what are the do's and don'ts for AI, because otherwise you are likely to have certain countries who are full speed ahead regardless of this, because of the inherent benefits of unleashed AI, depending whether it is on the finance sector or anything really.
Yeah. But even within a country and even within society itself, we have to look at the impact of AI in terms of either the disenfranchisement of a particular group or the growing of a sort of a digital divide, if you will, between the digital natives and also the people that have access. They have the resources and the access to those types of things, because those AI as it's continuing to evolve, it's going to not only enhance that digital divide, but it's going to turn it into almost unbridgeable chasm. And so there's so many moral dilemmas. So you take, for example, a country where everything is going to be paid for. All transactions are going to be done with QR codes, and there'll be no more cash. Does that mean that if you have reservations about privacy and paying electronically with everything, does that mean that the fact that cash is going to be eliminated somehow compromises people's privacy and other rights? These are all dilemmas. So AI is just pushing that envelope everywhere, right? Because of course there are benefits. There are many benefits to be had, but at the same time, does it compromise other basic inherent rights? Right. So I think there's a silver lining everywhere, in that if you're a technophile or a technophobe, you'll find reasons to argue either one way or the other. But the silver lining is that it could be that there are uses of technology that can be employed to enhance privacy in these types of scenarios. Right. And benefit business. And so there are all these market-driven initiatives around what I would call the privacy economy, that could create opportunities elsewhere. And then that comes back to our discussion about how AI is going to create all these new opportunities. That what I would call the privacy economy, or even the truth economy.
Right. No, I think that's very interesting. I think we're running a little bit low on time, but if you want to learn a little bit more about these topics, including cloud-based tools, social media, the e-commerce platforms that you mentioned, and AI, I'd again recommend that you take a look at the publication that was authored by Alexander, called "Micro and Small Business in Indonesia's Digital Economy," and this was circulated and published by the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. So it is a free publication.
It is. It's
Great.
Online. You can just Google it.
Yeah, so I think that's a very interesting look at how AI and different technologies that are taking over the industry today are beneficial. I think what I liked about this one is that it does focus on the positives of AI and what it can bring to small businesses. So I'd highly recommend everyone take a look at this. And thank you so much, Alexander, for coming in.
My pleasure.
Hope to do this again. As a reminder, we will be hosting these live broadcasts every month. So if you're listening, remember to sign up on our website for free and subscribe to our YouTube channel. This discussion will also be circulated within about 1 week's time. And ladies and gentlemen, this has been another episode of the ICC Academy Livecast. See you next time.